Hey, everybody out there in comic book land, it's Chuck Dixon. Another session of Ask Chuck Dixon, and I'm going to answer your questions about what I do for a living. And what I do for a living is I write comic books. And we've reached Ask Chuck Dixon number 25. How much fun have we had getting to this point? A little bit of housekeeping before I get to your questions. I've been informed that the more likes I have, the more YouTube will recommend me to other viewers. So if you like this video or you like any previous videos, just hit that old like button. It won't cost you anything and it'll help me out a whole lot, so I'm told. So there you go. And if you want to see these continue, more viewers would not help. Well, actually, it wouldn't hurt. I don't know what I'm saying. As you'll see as I get to the first question. Ron Hartley wants to know the subject of too many subplots in a story. How many subplots do you believe is too many? I just read a book under the banner of a well-known thriller writer. There were so many subplots going on, I started losing track of the main story. Well, I'm going to take you back to the man who taught me indirectly how to do subplots in a comic, how to work them, the mechanics of the whole deal. And that guy would be Paul Levitz. Now, Paul was longtime editor-in-chief, publisher of DC Comics, and most of the time I worked at DC was under his aegis, his steady hand at the wheel. And I didn't learn about subplots directly from Paul, but Paul and a number of the other editors, Archie Goodwin, Denny O'Neil, Mike Carlin, would have long discussions about comics, the medium. How's it work? How do you do superhero comics? How do you make them better? And in those discussions, Paul revealed that he used a subplot method when he wrote. And Paul did write. He was a longtime writer on Legion of Superheroes. I think he started writing it when he was 6. But no, he was a longtime writer on Legion of Superheroes. And of course, it's a huge ensemble cast, one of the biggest ensemble casts in superhero history. And of course, if he wanted to introduce subplots, he better make sure they paid off, that they were entertaining, that they built the story rather than taking away from it. And what Paul shared with the editorial folks was what's called the ABC or 1, 2, 3 method of subplotting. And this is a method used in soap operas. And I imagine it's used in soap operas all around the world, but Paul was using American soap operas as a model. He had read that soap operas always have 3 plot lines going, 3 plot lines simultaneously. And there's a plot line ending, a plot line in the middle, and a plot line beginning at all times. So when we would do our bat summits, we would basically lay things out that way. It would be basically a 3-tier grid, and we would work out our subplots and plot lines in that way, so that there was always a subplot coming to a conclusion. There was always an ongoing subplot that you were in the middle of, and still maintaining your interest. And then there was another one coming to that was beginning, some new subplot to spark your interest again. But the soap opera model has these subplots all running simultaneously, uh, but never ending or beginning simultaneously. If that makes any sense, it's the ongoing feel. It's because soap operas have to keep bringing you back and back and back and back every day, and so there always has to appear to be a progression of storyline constantly. With usually these shows have a large ensemble cast, so every character has an arc or combining characters or whatever. So basically, the ABC or 1, 2, 3 method makes sure that you don't lose track of your story. Your subplots have a clear beginning and a clear, hopefully resounding and entertaining end or conclusion. And that there's always another storyline going that sort of is the status quo for that period of time. So there you go. And if you've ever watched soap operas, and I've watched them casually, or heard people talk about them, storylines, your ending storyline usually ended on a Friday or a Monday. The cliffhanger would be on Friday, and then a new storyline would begin later in the week. So, so there you go. Now, as far as the subject of subplots entirely, there's one example of a movie I can think of that was all subplot. Pulp Fiction is pretty much, there's no through story in Pulp Fiction. It's a series of subplots, and it's very much the 1, 2, 3 method. Now, people call this an anti-structure film. It's all avant-garde and everything else. But what Tarantino did here was he had 3 engaging stories, none of which were um, good enough for a feature film. There wasn't enough material there, but he combines them and he has the characters cross over with one another. And, it's basically, it's a series of vignettes that tells an entire story, but it's not really ever one story. It's really 3 ongoing subplots that manage to crisscross and go back on each other. And ultimately, the whole film comes full cycle. Um, but it's a movie that's all subplot and no plot. How about that? Shaham, I'm sorry, man, I'm murdering your name. I'll never know how to pronounce your first name. You tried to help me out, and I couldn't do it. Anyway, boxing movies or boxing stories more general. What's the appeal? I think the appeal is pretty obvious. It's the drama of 2 men or 2 women in a ring, 2 athletes in a ring, and one's going to walk out the winner and the other's going to walk out the loser. It doesn't get more stark than that in drama. Um, and it's really just not more complicated than that. But it's how do you deal with that subject? Now, I'm going to give a few examples. This is a movie, The Setup. It's generally seen as a noir film. I don't so much see it as a noir film. Um, it's more of a hard-boiled drama. And the setup is Robert Ryan, and he's been asked to take a dive, and the film is shot in real time or as close to real time as you can get. So it's got like an 82-minute running time, and we don't really ever cut away. There's no fade outs or anything like that. So it takes place. The story takes place in that time frame, which is interesting. It's an interesting film. Um, Another one. Now you may not think of Mickey Rooney as an action star, but he made a film right after the war called Killer McCoy, and it is just an awesome boxing film, and it has all the tropes of a standard boxing film. There's an outside threat, there's an outside stakes to the fight. It's not just about winning a fight; it's more than that. And McCoy's being pushed around and abused and all that, and it, it's but it's a hell of a movie. And Mickey Rooney was a consummate performer who could basically uh, throw himself into any role and come up a winner. But it's a lot tougher than you would think a Mickey Rooney film would be. It's a lot more cynical, and it's got a thrilling fight conclusion, which every boxing film has to have, or it just ain't a boxing film. Which takes us to The Fighter. Mark Wahlberg is up and comer middleweight, and his brother Christian Bale is a drug addicted degenerate, and it's basically how they bond over boxing. And it's got some thrilling fight stuff in it as well, and awesome Boston locations and some tremendous acting throughout. It's definitely worth your time if you've never seen it. Another interesting film is Undisputed. It's a Walter Hill action film for the most part, but it's Wesley Snipes and Ving Rhames are former boxing champions who end up in the same prison together, and a sort of underground boxing match is organized by the wise guys, strictly for betting purposes. And it's a pretty brutal boxing film, but it's the same thing. One man goes in, one man goes out, and there's some interesting moral qualms, moral um, dilemmas in this film that have to be overcome. It's an interesting film. And of course, Rocky. You can't get away from Rocky. Rocky took the standard boxing film plot line and just stood it on its head. I didn't see this film when it came out in '77, but it must have stunned audiences, the end of this film. And if you haven't seen it, I won't spoil it for you. But you know, it took everything you wanted in a boxing film and gave you more. And of course, it's a wonderful portrait of Rocky Balboa. It's a wonderful portrait of the city of Philadelphia, where I grew up. Now, they made a lot of Rocky films, but after the initial Rocky film, my favorite is Rocky Five. And in this one, Rocky he's out of the boxing game, and boy, he's missing it. He's really missing being in the game. And he sort of promotes this prodigy, this young guy, who turns out not to be very grateful for the help. There's, but but it's a good film. But what elevates it to a great film is this amazing scene where Rocky is watching this guy fight. He can't go to the fight, but he's watching this guy fight on TV in his basement. He has like a basement rec room, and his family is with him. His kid and his wife and his brother-in-law, and they're all down in this basement watching this fight. And Rocky is sort of standing in the background, and he's watching this thing, and he's putting himself in the ring. It's an amazing scene because they keep cutting from the fight to Rocky just sort of leaning on a support column in the basement and sort of landing punches on the support column as his eyes are locked on that television, and he's putting himself in the place of that young fighter, and you can see there's this longing, there's this wish that he wishes he was in the ring. He wishes it was him, but he can't because he would be risking brain damage, a common theme in boxing films. And to make it even more touching, his wife, Adrian is standing on the basement steps, and she's looking over at him, and she's feeling his pain, but she can't say anything. She knows she can't say anything to him. There's nothing that will comfort him in that moment. And that really, it's one of my favorite scenes in all cinema, and it's very touching, which is unusual in a boxing film to find a scene that's touching. But the emotional depth of it is riveting. Another great boxing film, Raging Bull. Robert De Niro in a portrait of a man who's, I don't know, more animal than man, and the price he pays for basically, being a brawler, a killer, focusing on all the wrong aspects of boxing to win. It's not a sport to this guy. It's a struggle to the death, and you sort of see him fall apart as a human. It's an amazing portrayal, and the boxing sequences are brutal, but just incredibly shot film. Here's one you may not have heard of, but you really should see. It's called The Hammer. The Hammer, and it's Adam Carolla, who was a boxer. He boxed some amateur. I think he boxed some pro, and he has a fast right, and you see it in the film. You can't fake that. This guy has a fast right hand, and it's part comedy, but it's got all of the, it's not a ridiculous, Will Ferrell type comedy. It's a comedy, but it's very grounded, very human, has a whole lot of heart, and it has all the tropes of a boxing match, a boxing movie. It's got the climactic fight, and it's got all the boxing action you'd want to see, but it's also tied up in a portrait of a guy who basically has, nothing to lose. It's semi-autobiographical because in it Carolla is he's a construction worker, and his life's going nowhere, and he wants to make a change. And far too late in his life to be doing this, he gets back into the boxing game with a shot at being on the Olympic team. And it's at times heartbreaking, it's other times heartwarming, but it's a very funny movie. But the boxing sequences are for real. They're not played for laughs. And like I said, he's got an amazing right, which brings in the name The Hammer. Million Dollar Baby is, I don't know, I saw this movie cold. I knew nothing about it when I went to see it. And if you have never heard about this movie or never seen it, don't read any reviews. Don't go into it cold, because not knowing what was going to happen in this film, it blew me away. I couldn't believe it. Hilary Swank is terrific in the lead role, but Clint Eastwood gives, for my money, his best screen performance of all time in this film, as Hilary Swank's trainer manager in like these salon type boxing matches, done for small crowds with big money, and it's the film is it deals with a lot of subjects beyond boxing. There's quite a bit of boxing in it, and it's based on a story by a guy who was a professional cut man in the ring. This guy was right there for a lot of big bouts. Many years of observing things in the ring and a very keen observation of the kind of personalities and stuff who get into the game. So those are the ones I would recommend, and I hope it made it obvious why the boxing movie holds such appeal even to this day. Generally we see like one boxing movie a year released here in the United States, and they always do well. They always do well because people respond to the whole idea of one athlete versus another for everything. Chuck Johnson says, this may have already been asked and answered, and I've forgotten it. Yeah, I have that problem too. You've worked with several comic book publishers through the years without regard to the characters you wrote. For which company did you most enjoy working? Well, I guess, I was at DC longest, and I had the best time there, but it didn't really have anything to do with the company per se. It had to do with who I was working for and with. I mean, I had Denny O'Neil, Archie Goodwin, Scott Peterson, Darren Vincenzo, Jordan Gorfinkel, and a number of other, Chris Duffy there for a while. Just terrific editors. I mean, guys who really knew how to put a comic book together. They understood the medium. And most importantly, they were interested in doing quality work. They were as interested in producing the best comics we could, and they were just as interested as I was. I mean, I wanted to be doing my best work, and so yeah, I probably had the most fun there. But people say, is there a personality between the various companies? It really depends on your editor. I mean, if I've got a good editor, it doesn't really matter where I'm working, and and if you got a bad editor, yeah, it's a nightmare. I've been lucky. Primarily I've worked with people that understood what I bring to the party. So I've enjoyed working with almost everybody. There's been a few pistols, uh, you know, but companies go through sea changes. Their attitudes change and everything else, and you know, so they're never the same. And as I said, it all depends on the personnel that are working there. That's the most important thing. It's who's on the other end of the phone, not what company logo is up in the corner of the cover. So it's a very personal relationship. Scott McCullough with a long question for which I have a long answer. I have a question for Ask Chuck. I was looking through a stack of Birds of Prey comics from your run on the book, and this question occurred to me after looking at issue 26 with Bane and Black Canary. As a writer, how often do or did you suggest a cover layout, design, concept, and possibly any bylines, hype, talking speech bubbles from characters, etc. on the covers of the books that you authored? As the norm, I've assumed it was mainly the editor's input and decision on what to place on the covers, perhaps with the artist's creative input? Or did you find that you can offer collaborative input? Does it depend on the type of book or relationship you have with a title and or editor and publisher? Well, I've been really lucky in my career that I've had some awesome covers on my books. But I really had nothing to do with it. These are usually the choice between the editor and if the company has an art director. And a lot of times you just have people who are really good at doing covers and they're just simply handed the assignment. One of the reasons that I have so many great covers on my books, I attribute to the fact that I used to work way ahead of schedule. So if someone like a Dave Stevens or a Michael Golden came into the offices looking for cover assignments, my scripts were ready to go. So they could just hand them a script, they could read it over and pick an image from that script. Not only did I get great covers, I also got covers that actually had something to do with the story inside, which is always good. I mean, there's nothing wrong with iconic covers. Um, they're cool too, but it's nice every once in a while to have some covers that inform the reader of what's going on inside the issue. Um, Now, the thing is, how important are covers to comic books? And they're not as important as they used to be. Once upon a time, the cover was everything. The cover was the at the point of sale, the reader's first introduction to the comic. They saw the cover. If it interested them, they might take a peek inside. I always did because I wanted to know who was drawing them. Uh, and the cover drew you in, interested you, engaged you. Hopefully, you'd buy the comic because and that's what you were judging it on. But it, and these covers, you know, did everything they could to present an image you couldn't walk away from, that you'd want to spend your dime or 12 cents or whatever on. And so it was the publisher direct to the consumer. Now, in those days, with newsstand sales, everything was based on returns. A publisher knew by how many books the news agency sent back that were returned from the drugstore or the newsstand. They knew how many they had sold. And they knew whether a cover worked or a cover didn't. And then, more importantly, they learned what covers did work, and they would double down on that. Maybe it was the artist, maybe it was the subject matter, maybe it was the layout. A lot of publishers thought maybe it's the color of the covers. So a lot of factors would go in to the publishers looking at these covers because, as I said, this is the point of sale. This is the grabber, and it was important. But as years went by and the direct market emerged, and newsstand sales became less and less important, although I still think they were important, but the companies believed they weren't. They didn't think newsstand sales were the future. They thought the comic shops were the future. Ha, ha, ha. Uh, and the covers weren't important anymore. Yeah, if you go to the comic shop, you're going to see the covers displayed like this, and the cover might grab you and you might want to buy it. But you're not the customer in the direct sales market. The retailer is. It's the comic shop owner who the publishers are selling to through the distributor. The comic shop owner is the customer because these things aren't returnable. So you can't woo a comic shop owner with a pretty cover. Sometimes you can. I can't think of any artists today. Maybe there are some, but back in the day, you could sell a lot more covers if you had Dave Stevens or Jim Steranko or Art Adams doing the cover. There were people that liked covers by those artists and would buy the comic regardless of what was inside. I don't think that happens so much anymore. If it does, please someone correct me. I'm just not aware of any artists who move a cover or move a comic by the cover. But yeah, covers became less and less important. And the interiors did, or stunts did, or events did, or whatever you could do to woo the retailer to buy more. And the thing is, you could have the greatest cover on earth, but if the retailer only orders 3 copies and they're all gone by Wednesday afternoon, nobody's going to see your cover. So it's not the consumer you're selling to anymore, and that's the plain, simple, brutal fact of it all. Now, covers. What about covers? When I was on Detective Comics, I had a long run on Detective Comics. We had some frankly hideous covers, and I could never understand why the editors went for them. And they certainly weren't indicative of what the comic looked like inside, because at this point, Graham Nolan was on Detective with me, and I was like, why wouldn't you let Graham do the covers? And it took a long time for me to argue and Graham to argue even more persuasively that perhaps Graham should be doing the covers on his own books. And eventually that happened. And Graham did what I believe is just an incredible run of covers that not only are beautiful, the compositions are terrific, they're also compelling, they're engaging, and it's a better representation. We've got Graham Nolan interiors. We need Graham Nolan's imagery on the cover because that's going to sell it. And eventually, as I said, we convinced the editors to let Graham do his own covers, and I think they were very pleased with the results. I mean, who wouldn't be? This stuff's gorgeous. Um, and Graham's image of Batman in the 90s became the iconic image of Batman, and there was no reason not to, put him up there. So there you go. That's how that happened. Now, as far as me suggesting layouts or anything else, I can only think of really one time that happened. I did a really rough marker drawing for this cover. I just finished the story, and I thought, wow, it'd be neat because it was a Firefly story, and it was all the characters had escaped from Gotham, so you had all these major villains in the issue, and I thought it'd be cool to show them in flames behind a ready-to-fight Batman. And Kelly Jones took it, my miserable little faxed-in drawing, and turned it into something beautiful. Chuck Johnson again. Thank you, Chuck. Through the years, I've come to notice my favorite writers are able to successfully drop some humor into their stories. Most of the time, it's subtle. It always rounds out and humanizes the story, and it never overpowers the story. You and maybe 3 or 4 others are the only ones to be able to do it consistently. Is this something that you do purposely, or is this more organic and just happens? For a lot of it, it's organic. It just feels right. Even in something as grim and dark and, dare I say, gritty as The Punisher, I felt there was room for humor. And a lot of times the humor arose from The Punisher's juxtapositioning of his captions to what was going on in the story. His captions always underplayed the violence that you would see in the panel. And I give you examples, but they don't work out of context because The Punisher was never about one-liners, tough guy lines, or anything like that. These were more subtle understatements of what you were seeing. And they were humor, not comedy. There's a big difference. I think I've discussed this in previous videos. In comedy is jokes and gags. Humor is more, it has to be more of a natural extension of the character or a part of the story. And we all experience this. We all use humor in our daily lives to make someone feel more comfortable in a conversation, an icebreaker, break the tension, or simply make an observation to someone. And we use it constantly. And sometimes even in dire circumstances, it's literally comedy relief to interject some humor. I think it's a natural human instinct amongst those well-adjusted enough. But to have the Punisher be dark, dark, dark all the time, and have any story be dark, 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 and grim all the time, it's not fun. It's not a fun story to watch. It's somebody recently told me, I'd never heard this term before, misery porn, and that's what it is. Let's have a few gags. I mean, like this. Here's an instance in the Punisher. It doesn't actually involve the Punisher. Here you have a scene, and it's the typical scene you saw in every single 80s action film. Any Schwarzenegger or Chuck Norris or movie with Stallone, and it's the hero. He's arming up. He's getting all his weapons together. And there's dramatic music in the background. Well, I play it, and there's some kind of dialogue going, dramatic dialogue going on in the background, and we assume because it's a Punisher, it's an issue of Punisher War Journal, that it is the Punisher. When we pull the camera back, it's not. It's a Punisher wannabe. And the dialogue we were hearing is coming from a Western on television. And, this kind of out of shape, chubby guy wants to go out and be the Punisher. And, it works on surprise. You weren't expecting this. And that was the source of the humor. And surprise is a big source of humor. But moving on, some books, I worked the humor in as part of the story because it was part of the genre. In Way of the Rat, we had Popo, who was great for comic relief. He was a talking monkey who oftentimes was drunk, and he would make these very, very acerbic comments on what was going on, and especially toward the hero of the book, Boone. And also introduced some other comedy relief characters, some cousins of Boone's, who were kind of like Sam Ho Hung, Ewan Bao kind of characters, and they were inserted, for laughs. They were, fool characters, Laurel and Hardy, that kind of thing. But it fit the 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 lighter kind of kung fu drama, the lighter kind of period martial arts drama, kind of stuff, Drunken Master, that kind of thing, and it seemed apropos. But I work humor in even now as an extension of character. This is something I'm working on currently. It's a Robin Hood series from Zenesco. And yeah, it's not the funniest gag in the world. Probably nobody will laugh at it. You might smile at it. You might be amused. But that's not the point. The point is this is a natural reaction of the character. She's nervous as hell in this situation because she's expecting horrible things to happen, and she can't help but make a joke, just to kind of leaven the grim proceedings going on. Now, some things border on comedy. When the Condiment King was introduced on Batman, he was strictly comedy relief, strictly for laughs. He's a buffoon villain who uses condiments, mustard, ketchup, things like that, in his crimes. He's a lame ass theme villain for Batman the animated series. And I thought, wow, I just love this idea that there would be, loser theme villains. They wouldn't be all successful like Joker or Penguin. You'd have some guys that, it was all about the theme, and the theme was stupid, and they'd fall flat on their face as criminals. So I introduced Condiment King into the regular Batman continuity as kind of a gag villain. But the payoff for him was that he was actually dangerous. In the comics, he was actually dangerous. I dealt with something called the Scoville scale, which is a scale of spiciness that delivers anaphylactic shocks. And the Condiment King, while they look like a joke, while they look like a buffoon, he mixed some horseradish and some ghost peppers into his little mix, and he actually takes our villains or our heroes down a few notches. He's actually dangerous, and if Robin or Canary or Blue Beetle here had an allergy to any of these things, the guy could actually be deadly. So that was, I just love the Condiment King. I'm glad I got to put him in the comics. It was fun. Now, again, humor is sometimes an extension of a character. This is a part of a story I did. It was an origin of the Riddler, drawn by Kieran Dwyer. I did an amazing job on it. It was an annual, a Detective Comics annual. And the Riddler, in my version of the Riddler, he's kind of pathetic. He's narcissistic egomaniac, but he's kind of a pathetic wretch, who no one ever really takes terribly seriously. That's why he becomes dangerous, because he very much wants to be taken seriously. And in this part of the story, he doesn't have his costume yet or anything else, but he realizes he needs a gang. He can't work solo, so he tries to recruit some henchmen, but he can't resist being the Riddler. And of course, he pays for that. And the real payoff with this gag, other than the surprise, because he gets punched on the next page. I kind of like that. The page ends with him asking that silly question, and here he gets his answer on the following page. But what sells the humor is, just like the Punisher, his understatement of what's going on. He's sort of over-articulates his situation and underplays it at the same time. And I always find that funny. Batman really lent itself to humor more than almost anything else I've ever worked on. We had a lot of running gags. They used this in the animated series, and we used it in the comic. The running gag that every time that Batman and Gordon met, Batman would vanish while Gordon was still talking, or Gordon thought there was more to say. And he turns around and Batman's not there. And so this is one of the times that we dealt with that. And it was a nice running gag. It was a nice character bit. And what was fun was, you know, trying to change it up, make it different each time. So another one, and this is kind of this is a from a tech issue drawn by Stas Johnson. This was one of my favorites, and it's humor as Chuck Johnson said in the question, that humanizes the characters, and it's important to humanize Batman. You know, he's a man inside that suit. He's a person, and this is a sequence I used it. It's, you know, we see Batman and Robin, typical scene. They're up on the rooftop discussing, you know, a little exposition, discussing what's going on, and they're surprised. And this is a page turn panel. This is at the bottom of a page. They're suddenly surprised by who? And it turns out to be this woman who came up on the roof to hang clothes. And she passes out. And that's when Batman instructs Robin that, you know, they can't just leave like this because her clothes are laying all over the rooftop. They got to help her out. And so when she awakens, all of her clothes are neatly folded in the basket. And, you know, that's kind of funny. But what pays it off is that Batman didn't help. Robin did it all. And of course, Robin has a dig at Batman, basically calling him a bit of a slacker because he never learned how to fold clothes, even though he had a valet living with him the entire time. Now, humor in comics is not always appreciated. Some editors don't like it. Some editors are very, very, very serious about this stuff. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing. But when it goes from earnestness to obsession, it's not necessarily a good thing. I mean, I always say, don't take yourself seriously, but take your work seriously. So I did this Moon Knight story, and I think it was an Acts of Vengeance. And the deal with Acts of Vengeance was that all these villains were teaming up to go after heroes that they'd never faced before. I don't know why. But so Moon Knight gets to face 3 villains he's never faced before. And I sort of went through the who's who or whatever they had, a Marvel Universe guide, and looked for villains that they weren't using yet. And I picked Killer Shrike because he's kind of a badass. He's a killer. He's a homicidal guy. Look at the blades on his arm. And he's a mean guy, you know, everything else. And he's kind of a badass enough, you know, look here, he went up against Spider-Man. Badass enough to give Moon Knight a run for his money. I thought, well, that's great. He's going to be the real heavy here. And then I teamed him with the Trapster. And I thought, well, Killer Shrike is actually a killer. Trapster he's a lightweight, kind of a lightweight. And these are criminals. These are sociopaths. And they're the kind of personalities that have to establish dominance. And because Killer Shrike was, you know, I believe somewhat superpowered, Trapster is not, he becomes the alpha dog. And Killer Shrike, to establish dominance, begins, you know, abusing Trapster verbally. And he insults him. He calls him Pastepot Pete because that's what Trapster was called when he was first introduced. And he makes fun of his powers, which really aren't even powers. They're gadgets that shoot glue. So he really has a good time, you know, ranking on the Trapster. And I thought it was not only funny, but I thought it was extension of character. And it created some tension because you thought, well, how long is the Trapster going to put up with this creep? You know, pushing him around. And Trapster is nobody's sweetheart. But, you know, I liked everything about it. I thought this really works well. Well, the editor, really the first time I'd ever talked to this editor, called me on the phone and basically reamed me a new one because, you know, Marvel characters are beloved. The Marvel characters are iconic and you don't treat them this way. And I'm like, I didn't treat him this way. They're treating each other this way. It just seemed natural. They're villains, for God's sake. But this editor could not see that and felt highly insulted that that I would treat their characters with this much disdain and contempt and everything else. And I pretty much realized with that phone call that outside of working for Don Daly or Larry Hama, I was pretty much never going to be part of the Marvel mainstream. So I concentrated far more on my DC work, where my sense of humor was more appreciated and more welcome. So there you have it. That's this week's questions, and they were all good ones. So as I said before, if you can, hit that like button, I would greatly appreciate it if you liked this video. If you didn't, keep it to yourself, okay? Nobody has to know you didn't like it. And we'll see you back here next week, okay? See you down the road.